The wind came in, off the flats first, before anything else, dragging a fine red dust across the main street of Colton Wells, Texas, as if the land itself had decided to take back whatever civilization had tried to plant there. It was the last week of October, 1899, and the town had been dying slowly enough that most of its residents had stopped noticing the smell of it. The general store still opened each morning. The livery still took horses, but the bank had reduced its hours, and the schoolteacher had moved on to a better-paying county, and the men who sat outside the barber shop no longer talked about what they were going to do. They talked about what used to be. Into that dying, wind-scored place, on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was the color of old iron, rode Annie Oakley. She was 39 years old and between engagements. The Wild West show had completed its summer season, and the winter layover that followed was always the hardest stretch for her. Not for lack of comfort, but for lack of purpose. Frank was back in Cincinnati, seeing to some business matters, and she had taken the train south on a whim that had solidified somewhere around the Oklahoma border into something that felt more like a pull. She had heard from a woman on the train, a schoolteacher heading home to Abilene, that there was trouble in a small town called Colton Wells. Land trouble, a family being pushed out. The schoolteacher had said it with the resigned tone of someone who had seen it happen before and expected to see it happen again. And Annie had listened the way she always listened. Completely, without interrupting, storing every detail the way another person might store money. When she stepped off the train at the Colton Wells depot, she had no plan. She had her rifle in its case, her traveling trunk, and a gray-eyed calm that people who did not know her sometimes mistook for disinterest. Nobody asked her to stay. The depot agent recognized her name when she signed the hotel register, and his eyes went wide for just a moment, for professional discretion brought them back to level, and he said the room would be ready within the hour. She thanked him, collected her key, and walked out to stand on the hotel porch and look at the town she had decided, somewhere between the Oklahoma border and this porch, to understand. What she saw was a main street with the bones of ambition showing through its skin. There had been money here once. The buildings were solid, set back from the road, with a frontier dignity that cost real lumber and real labor. But the paint was going, and the post office was sharing a wall with what had once been a dressmaker's shop, and the space where a bank sign used to hang had been filled in with a piece of raw board that matched nothing around it. A few women moved along the boardwalk with that particular efficiency of people who have cut everything that wasn't necessity from their lives. A man was loading a wagon with furniture, the particular slow, careful way of someone who knows they will not be able to replace any of it. Annie watched the man with the wagon for a long time. Then she went inside to wash her face and change her clothes and find out what she had actually come here for. The woman being pushed out of Colton Wells was named Clara Briggs, and she had been born in 1856 in a farmhouse 12 miles east of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the fourth of 7 children in a family that had treated hard work as the only real currency. Her father was a man who believed that land meant permanence, and that permanence meant safety, and he had said this so many times, in so many variations, across so many kitchen tables, that it had become the organizing principle of Clara's adult life without her ever consciously choosing it. Land was the thing you held on to. Land did not leave. Land did not get sick and die, did not run off with a better opportunity in a city somewhere. Land stayed, and if you stayed with it and worked it honestly, it would keep you. She had come to Texas in 1881 with her husband, Roy Briggs, who was neither a romantic nor a fool, but something more useful. A practical man with a specific skill. Roy could find water, not in any mystical sense, though people who needed him badly enough sometimes dressed it up in those terms. He had spent 5 years studying the land and the rock formations of the southern plains, and had developed an understanding of aquifer behavior that was, in its way, a form of genius. He knew where to dig, and how deep, and at what angle, and in a part of the country where water was the difference between a settlement and a graveyard, this knowledge was worth a great deal. They had used the money from his work, over 10 years of it, to build something in Colton Wells that Clara was proud of in the specific, detailed way that only genuine labor can produce. The property was called the Briggs Well Works, which was a plain name for what was, in 1891, the most reliable well digging and water sourcing operation in a 70-mile radius. They had 12 employees at their peak, men who had learned the work from Roy, who had families in town, who had built their lives around the reliability of the wages. Clara ran the books, negotiated contracts, handled the correspondence with the land offices and the railroad surveyors and the town councils of 6 different counties who needed her husband's knowledge to make their ambitions real. Roy was the one who knew the water. Clara was the one who made certain that knowledge was compensated at its actual value, which was something Roy, left to his own instincts, would have dramatically underpriced. Roy had died in the spring of 1896, a Saturday morning, quickly, of a heart that had simply used up everything it had. He was 43. Clara was 40. She had 2 children, James, who was 14, and Rose, who was 11. She had the business, the property, a modest savings, and the complete knowledge of how everything worked. She was not a widow who needed rescuing. She was a woman who had just lost her partner in a joint enterprise and needed to determine which parts of the enterprise only he could do and which parts she could do in his place. The answer had surprised her. Almost all of it she could do in his place. She had been doing most of it anyway, handling the business side while Roy handled the physical work. She hired a foreman named Dutch Perryman, who had worked for Roy for 9 years and who knew the water almost as well. She kept the contracts, she kept the employees, she kept the revenue. For 2 years after Roy died, the Briggswell works ran well enough that she allowed herself to stop holding her breath. Then the trouble began. And it did not come from the direction she had been watching. The Colton Land and Title Company had been incorporated in Dallas in 1897, and its principal officer was a man named Gerald Fitch, who wore good suits and traveled on a private rail car and spoke in the measured tones of someone who has learned that volume is for people who are not winning. He had made his money identifying properties in declining rural counties that had some underlying value the current owner did not know how to monetize, and he was very good at his work. What he saw in the Briggswell works was not the business. It was the property itself, 18 acres that sat directly over an aquifer system that Roy Briggs had mapped in his notebooks. And those notebooks, Clara did not realize, were potentially the most valuable single asset on the premises. Fitch had sent a man to make an offer in January of 1898. Clara had declined. Fitch had sent a lawyer to review her title in March of 1898, and the lawyer had found something, a surveying discrepancy from 1883 that created a gap of ambiguity in the original land filing, the kind of gap that a good attorney in a favorable forum could leverage into a cloud on the title, sufficient to make the property unmortgageable, unsellable, and subject to reversion proceedings. Clara had not known the gap was there. Nobody had, including Roy. It was not fraud, and it was not entirely an accident. It was the ordinary consequence of rushed frontier paperwork from a period when half the surveyors in Texas were measuring by memory and optimism. By August of 1898, Fitch's attorneys had filed a title challenge in the district court in San Antonio, and Clara Briggs was no longer the unchallenged owner of anything. She was a respondent in a legal proceeding she did not fully understand, in a city she could not afford to travel to regularly, with lawyers she could barely pay, against a company whose legal fees were smaller than what Fitch spent on his private rail car in a calendar year. The first attorney Clara hired took her money and wrote 3 letters to Fitch's law firm. The letters were polite, carefully reasoned, and completely ineffective. He told her in September that the case was difficult and that she should consider a negotiated settlement. She asked him what that meant in specific terms, and he said that Fitch would likely offer something for the property, perhaps 60 cents on the dollar of assessed value, and that she could walk away with something instead of risking everything in litigation. She asked him what her chances were in litigation, and he paused long enough that she understood the answer without needing to hear it said. She did not settle. She dismissed the attorney and spent 3 weeks in her kitchen at night, reading the legal filings herself by lamplight, after James and Rose were in bed, making notes in the margins in her careful, particular handwriting. She did not have legal training. She had something else. She had 12 years of navigating contracts and land filings and the correspondence of government land offices. And she had a memory that did not let go of details. And she had the specific kind of determination that comes not from courage in the dramatic sense, but from the understanding that there is simply no alternative. She had gone to the county recorder's office in Colton Wells in October of 1898 and asked to see every document related to her original title filing. The clerk, a young man named Hartwell, had looked at her with that particular expression Clara had learned to read. The expression of a person assessing whether to be helpful based on who was doing the asking. And had told her the records were public and she was welcome to review them, but that pulling them out of storage would take some time and he was very busy. She had thanked him and told him she would wait. She had sat in the chair next to his desk for 4 hours, doing nothing, saying nothing, until the records appeared. She had found something in those records. Not a solution, but a thread. A reference to an 1879 federal survey that predated the 1883 survey Fitch's lawyers were using as their point of attack. If the 1879 survey could be located and was consistent with her 1883 filing, it would collapse the discrepancy argument entirely. She had written to the General Land Office in Washington, D.C. She had written twice. She had received, after 3 months, a response informing her that the records from that period were catalogued but not indexed, and that locating a specific survey would require a formal request and a processing fee, and an indeterminate wait time. She had paid the fee. She had waited. The wait had become 6 months, and the district court in San Antonio had set a hearing date, and the processing in Washington had not produced any result, and Clara Briggs was standing in a town that was already half gone, trying to hold on to the thing her husband had built, with a legal deadline bearing down on her like the red dust off the flats. She had tried the bank, the First Colton Trust, which had been the financial backbone of the county for 20 years, and whose president, a man named Aldous Maine, had shaken Roy Briggs's hand at the groundbreaking of his well house, and told him this was the kind of enterprise that built civilization in this country. Clara had gone to Maine in March of 1899 and asked for a loan against the property to fund her legal defense. Maine had regret in his voice and numbers in his hands. The title cloud made the property ineligible as collateral. His hands were tied. He was sorry. He had liked Roy very much. She had tried the county commissioner. He had listened carefully and told her that the county could not intervene in private civil proceedings. He had suggested she contact her state representative. She had written to the state representative. She received a form letter about agricultural policy. She had tried the other business owners in town, the ones who had worked with Roy, who had gotten their water from his contracts, who had employed men from his payroll. She had asked them, plainly and without embellishment, to co-sign a petition to the district court, attesting to the legitimacy of her operation and the economic harm that would follow its dissolution. 7 had agreed. 3 had declined not unkindly, explaining that they had their own dealings with the Colton Land and Title Company and could not afford the conflict. The petition had been submitted. The court had received it as a character exhibit and set it aside as irrelevant to the title question. By October of 1899, the hearing was 6 weeks away, and Dutch Perryman had told her quietly, with the particular gentleness of a man delivering news he has been carrying for a while, that 2 of the remaining crew members had found other work. They had families. They could not wait out a legal fight of indefinite duration. She had told him she understood, and she had meant it. She had gone home that evening and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Roy's notebooks, which she kept in a locked box under the floorboards, and thought about what Roy would have done. Roy would have found the water. He always found it. The question was whether she could. She was still sitting at that table, at 7 in the morning, when she heard the knock at her door, and opened it to find a small woman in traveling clothes, with gray eyes that looked at her the way very few people's eyes had ever looked at her, as though they were actually seeing her specifically, and not a situation to be managed or a problem to be sympathized with. "Mrs. Briggs," the woman said, "my name is Annie Oakley. I wonder if you have time to talk. Now, before we go any further into that kitchen, think about the last time you asked for help and every door closed. Maybe it was something smaller than what Clara faced. Maybe it was just one door, and it still cost you something. Drop a comment below if you know that particular kind of tired. We're going to stay with both of these women now. And this is the part that matters most." Clara stepped back from the door and let her in. It was not hospitality exactly. It was the movement of a woman who has been carrying something for a long time and has recognized in the person at the door something she cannot yet name but cannot quite turn away from either. The kitchen was clean and spare. There was coffee on the stove and 2 cups already on the table, which Clara noticed a moment after she noticed it. She had set 2 cups out the way you do when you have been alone, Long enough that even your hands start hoping. Annie took off her hat and set it on the edge of the table and sat in the chair across from Clara, without being invited to do so, but also without the presumptuous ease of someone who takes the best seat in a room. She sat the way she sat at the edge of the shooting arena, before a performance, settled, unhurried, arranged for the long duration. She put both hands on the table and looked at Clara directly. "I came in on the train yesterday," she said. "A woman named Hartfield told me about your situation between Oklahoma and here. I don't know if what she told me is accurate. I'd like to hear it from you." Clara looked at her for a moment. "You're the sharpshooter," she said. "I am. Why would that make you interested in my situation?" Annie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was the first thing that changed the temperature of the room. "I grew up in a farmhouse in Ohio," she said. "My father died when I was very young and my family nearly lost everything to debt. Everything. I know what it smells like when a place is trying to hold itself together." She paused. "I don't know yet if there's anything I can do, but I'd like to hear it all, if you're willing." Clara was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried when Roy died, not in front of anyone, not until the house was empty and the children were with her sister for the night. She did not cry now, but something in her chest, some particular knot that had been there for so long she had stopped noticing it, shifted slightly. "It's a long account," she said. "I have the morning," Annie said. "I have more than that if it takes more." Clara poured the coffee. And then she began. She started at the beginning. Not the beginning of the legal trouble. The beginning. The farmhouse in Pennsylvania. Her father's voice saying, "Land is the only thing that stays." Roy's hands, which were the most careful hands she had ever seen on a working man. Precise and deliberate in everything they touched. She had not intended to start there. But Annie had asked for everything, and it turned out that everything had to start in Pennsylvania, because that was where the idea of the thing had begun. The idea that a piece of earth you stood on, and worked, and held in your name, was not just an asset. It was a statement about who you were and what your life had been. Annie listened. She did not shift in her chair. She did not look at the window or the stove or the door. She looked at Clara Briggs with those gray eyes, and she received the account the way a very good marksman receives information about wind direction and light. Not passively, but actively, cataloging, incorporating, filing each detail into a picture that was assembling itself in her mind with each new piece of information. When Clara got to Roy's method, the way he read the rock formations, the angle of the dig, the signs he looked for on the surface that told him what was happening 30 feet below, Annie said, "Can you explain that?" The reading of it. What was he actually looking at? Clara stopped. It was not a question she had been asked before. People asked about the business, about the contracts and the revenue and the legal proceedings. Nobody had asked about the method. "Roy used to say that water doesn't hide," she said slowly. "It just talks quietly. You have to know the language of the landscape, the way a dry stream runs, the angle of rock strata at the surface, the particular way buffalo grass grows when there's something underneath keeping it alive." She paused. He kept notebooks, everything he observed, all his methods, the complete records of every well he ever dug, where they were, what the surface signs had been, what he found, and at what depth. Annie was very still. "Those notebooks," she said. "Where are they now?" "Under the floorboards," Clara said. "In a locked box." She looked at Annie. "I know what you're going to say. Fitch's lawyers don't know about them, or if they do, they can't prove they exist." "I wasn't going to say that," Annie said quietly. "I was going to ask if you'd considered that they might be the most important part of your case." Clara set her cup down. "I've considered it. The problem is that Roy's notes are practical documents. They're not legal documents. The title dispute isn't about the quality of his work. It's about the validity of the original land filing." "No," Annie said. "The title dispute is about the 1883 survey. But the 1883 survey isn't the only document that matters if you can find the 1879 one." She paused. "You said you wrote to the General Land Office. 8 months ago. No result. Did you write to anyone in Washington who could push the request forward? A senator? A congressman?" Clara looked at her. "I wrote to the state representative." "A state representative," Annie said, and her tone was not unkind, but it was precise. "The General Land Office is a federal body. It answers to Congress. A state representative has no leverage over it." She was quiet for a moment. "I have met, over the years of touring, a considerable number of federal officials, congressmen, senators, cabinet secretaries. I have performed for presidents. She said this without inflation, not as a boast, as a fact. I know people who could make one telephone call and have that survey document located and transmitted within 2 weeks. Clara Briggs looked at this small woman across the kitchen table and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in almost 2 years. Not hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous, too expensive. Something more preliminary than hope. The sense that a door that had seemed fixed might be operable. Why would you do that? Clara asked. And here Annie was quiet, for longer than she had been quiet since she sat down. She looked at the table for a moment. Then at the window, where the October light was coming in sideways across the clean floor. Then she looked back at Clara. I want to tell you something honest, she said. I spend my life performing a version of myself for audiences. I shoot things and I smile. And the audience applauds and I take my bow. I am very good at it and I am genuinely grateful for it. But I have been thinking, this past year, about what any of it actually amounts to. She stopped. My husband and I don't have children. I have been fortunate in ways that most women like me, women who came from nothing, are not fortunate. And I find myself wondering, with some frequency, what the fortune is actually for. Clara did not say anything. This was the right choice. She understood, with the instinct of a woman who had negotiated contracts for 2 decades, that this was not a moment for reassurance. This was a moment that needed to breathe. I came from a county infirmary, Annie said. When I was a child, my mother couldn't feed us all, and I was sent to work for a family who were not kind. I shot my way out of that life, literally. I was 10 years old and hunting game to sell to hotels to pay off my mother's mortgage. 12 years old when I paid it off. She paused. I have thought about what would have happened if someone with resources had come through that county and looked at what my mother was actually facing and done something concrete, not sympathy. Something concrete. She picked up her coffee cup, then set it down again without drinking. You are not my mother, and I am not 12 years old. But I know what this kind of trouble looks like, and I happen to have resources that could be applied to it. Clara said, I can't pay you. I know that. I can't promise you any outcome. That's not how I would put the proposition, Annie said. The proposition is this. I would like to understand your situation completely, and then I would like to see what I can do about it. If nothing comes of it, you are no worse off than you are right now. If something comes of it, then we'll see. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving through the space between the buildings with a low sound that was almost a voice. Clara looked at this woman, this famous, small, precise woman who had ridden into a dying town alone, on a Tuesday, for no reason that made any practical sense, and said, all right, then, I'll tell you the rest. She told Annie about Dutch Perryman, who had worked for Roy since the 2nd year of the business, and who could find water by himself now, though not as reliably as Roy had, because Roy had accumulated 20 years of specific regional knowledge that could not be entirely transmitted, only partially. She told Annie about the 2 employees who had just left. She told her about James, who was 17 now and wanted to continue the business if it survived, who had been going out on jobs with Dutch since he was 15, and had started to develop Roy's particular attentiveness to the surface of things. She told her about Rose, who was 12, and who was doing her schoolwork at the kitchen table, because the school teacher had gone to a better-paying county, and the town had not yet hired a replacement. Annie asked about the specific documents in the title dispute, the exact filing numbers, the dates, the names of Fitch's attorneys. Clara produced them from a folder she kept on the kitchen shelf, organized in the careful system of a woman who knows that if she doesn't keep track, nobody else will. Annie read through them without speaking. She asked 3 specific questions about the 1883 survey. Who had performed it? Under what authority? And whether the original surveyor was still living. The surveyor was named Abel Crockett, Clara said. She believed he was still alive. He had been an old man in 1883, and would be an old man in 1899, if he was still alive at all. But she had heard his name mentioned by a land agent in San Antonio 18 months ago in the present tense. If the original surveyor is alive, Annie said slowly, and if he can attest to the accuracy of the survey as he performed it, that is a different kind of document than a government record. That is first-hand testimony. That is harder to attack. Clara stared at her. I didn't think of that. You were thinking about the 1879 survey, which is still the better approach if we can locate it. But this is a second path. She paused. In shooting, we call it having a secondary shot. If the first trajectory is blocked, you have already computed the second one. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something she had not said to anyone in almost 2 years. I need help. I need someone who knows how to operate in rooms I don't have access to, on behalf of something I've been trying to hold together alone. She stopped. That's the honest version. That's the version I prefer, Annie said. Then there was the silence. The first real one. The kind where both people are not preparing to speak, but simply existing in the same understanding. The wind moved outside. Rose could be heard moving in the room above the kitchen. Annie looked at the locked box under the floorboards. She didn't know it was there. But Clara had glanced at the floor without quite meaning to. The involuntary movement of someone thinking of something they've been protecting. Show me the notebooks, Annie said. Clara looked at her. You said they contain everything, he observed. His methods, his records, every well he ever dug. Annie was quiet for a moment. And when she spoke again, her voice had something in it that was not quite different from its normal precision, but was something additional to it. A quality Clara could not name immediately. It was, she would understand later, genuine curiosity, the kind that is not performed and cannot be manufactured. I would like to see how he thought about things. I would like to see what a man who could find water by reading the surface of the land actually could put down on paper. Clara lifted the board in the corner of the kitchen. It was loose for exactly this purpose, and took out the box and set it on the table, and found the key on the chain she wore at her neck. The box opened with a sound that was clean and sharp in the quiet kitchen. Roy's notebooks were ordinary composition books, 23 of them, their covers worn smooth by the particular handling of a man who referred to them constantly. Clara set them on the table. Annie looked at them for a moment before she touched one. Then she opened the first. The handwriting was dense and methodical, the script of a practical man who wrote not for style but for accuracy, who needed to be able to read his own notes in bad light and tired conditions, diagrams interspersed with text, surface profiles, rock strata cross-sections, notes on buffalo grass distribution, measurements and depths and yield estimates, all in a system that was self-referencing and internally coherent, not a scientific treatise. Something more specific than that. A working knowledge, accumulated across 20 years, of where water lived in this particular region of the earth. Annie turned the pages slowly. She did not speak. This was not the silence of polite attention. It was the silence of a person actually reading, actually absorbing. Clara watched her, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Watching a stranger handle her husband's notebooks, she felt that someone else was finally in the room with this thing that Roy had built. This accumulated intelligence that had been sitting under her floor for 3 years with nobody to receive it, nobody to continue it. After a long time, Annie looked up. This is his method, she said, the specific method, written down in enough detail that someone could learn it. Dutch Perryman learned most of it from working alongside Roy, Clara said. But he said himself that there are pieces he never fully got. The way Roy read the rock strata, especially. Annie closed the notebook carefully and put it on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then, she looked at Clara and said something that was the truest thing Clara would think later that ever been said in that kitchen. This knowledge belongs to this county, Annie said. Not to Gerald Fitch, not to a land company in Dallas. This is what someone spent 20 years learning, so that this land could produce something. If Fitch takes this property and locks those notebooks away, that knowledge disappears. That is not a transaction. That is a destruction. Clara could not speak. She nodded. They sat with that for a while. The morning had moved to midday without either of them tracking it precisely. And Rose had come downstairs and been introduced, and had looked at Annie Oakley with the particular gaze of a 12-year-old who is too proud to show she is impressed but cannot quite suppress it. And Annie had spoken to her directly and without condescension, asking her what she was studying. Rose had said mathematics and Annie had said, that was exactly right, that mathematics was the foundation of everything useful she had ever done. Geometry especially, the calculation of angles and distances. Rose had gone back upstairs with a slightly different expression than she had come down with. After Rose had gone, Clara said, "There's something I haven't told anyone." Annie waited. The 1879 Federal Survey. I have a reason to believe it exists beyond just knowing it was done. Clara paused. Roy found a reference to it in a letter from an old surveyor he corresponded with in 1887, a man named Harold Fenn, who worked for the General Land Office in the 1870s and retired to New Mexico. Roy kept the letter. She opened the notebook box again and found the letter, folded inside the back cover of the first notebook. Fenn describes the 1879 survey in specific terms. He describes the aquifer system, the boundaries, the filing date. This letter would establish the survey's existence definitively. If the document itself could be located with this information as a search key, there would be no ambiguity. Annie took the letter and read it. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it as if she were measuring something. "This changes the situation," she said quietly. "This is not a vague request to locate an old survey. This is a specific request with specific parameters: date, surveyor, filing region, subject matter. The right person at the General Land Office, presented with this letter, could locate that document in a matter of days." "Do you know the right person?" Clara asked. "I know someone who does," Annie said. "A senator from Ohio who owed my husband a personal favor 3 years ago and has been looking for an opportunity to settle it." She paused. "He will not be acting from altruism. He will be acting from the logic of political economy. But the result will be the same." Clara looked at the letter, then at Annie, then at the notebooks laid out on the table between them. The afternoon light had shifted, moving across the notebooks in a slow golden angle that made them look, for a moment, like something more valuable than composition paper, which they were. "Roy spent his whole life building this," she said. "He used to say that knowledge is the only thing you can give away completely and still keep. That what he knew about water in this county, once it was learned, could not be unlearned." She stopped. "I want to keep it, not just the property, the work, the method. James has already started to develop it. If we lose the property, we lose the platform to continue the work. And if the work stops, it starts over somewhere badly, from a lower level," Annie said. "Someone else has to relearn what Roy already knew." Yes, the room was quiet again. Annie had been keeping something back. Clara could feel it. Not as a deception, but as the particular quality of a person who has been listening carefully and has arrived at something they are not yet sure how to say. She had the patience to wait for it. "There is something you said earlier," Annie said, "about Roy's method, the way he read the buffalo grass distribution. You said there were patterns he used to identify, surface signs. Could you describe those specifically?" Clara frowned slightly, not with irritation but with the particular frown of someone accessing a specific memory. "He used to look for a particular density of growth. Buffalo grass is drought-tolerant, but when it grows in certain configurations, circular patches, he called them, with a specific kind of density at the center, it indicated subsurface moisture at a depth consistent with a viable aquifer, combined with the angle of the rock strata visible at any nearby cut or embankment." Annie was quiet. Then she said, "I have ridden across a great deal of western land. I have never looked at it the way you just described. I've seen the grass and the rock and the dry creek beds, but I haven't been reading them." She paused. "I didn't know there was anything to read." "Most people don't," Clara said. "That's why Roy's knowledge was worth what it was worth." "Can you teach me? Right now. Can you describe the method in enough detail that I could walk out to a piece of land and at least begin to see what he was seeing?" Clara looked at her. This was not what she had expected. She had expected practical assistance, letters written, contacts called, resources applied. Not this. Not a famous woman, sitting at her kitchen table, asking to learn how her dead husband read the ground. "I can try," she said. And so Clara Briggs, who had been alone with this knowledge for 3 years, opened Roy's first notebook and began to teach. She started with the strata. Roy had drawn detailed cross-sections on the first pages of the notebook. The layered cake of the southern plains subsurface, limestone over shale over sandstone, over the ancient deposits where water accumulated. She explained what each layer meant in terms of permeability, of yield, of the difficulty of the dig. Annie leaned over the notebook and looked at the diagrams and asked specific questions. Not the questions of someone performing interest, but the questions of someone who was actually building a model in their mind. What does the transition between limestone and shale look like at the surface? How far down, typically, was the productive layer in this region? What was the range of variation? Clara answered each question from memory, supplementing with the notebooks when she reached the edge of what she held by heart. She was a good teacher. She did not know this about herself, had not had occasion to discover it, but she was. She knew the subject completely, and she had the particular skill of starting with what the other person already knew and building from there. She did not condescend, and she did not simplify beyond accuracy. Annie listened and looked and asked. She got something wrong. She suggested that the presence of any buffalo grass in high density would be indicative. And Clara corrected her. It was the specific circular configuration, not high density generally. That was the marker. High density without the circular pattern often meant surface runoff concentration, not subsurface moisture. Annie absorbed the correction without embarrassment. She tried again, better. At one point she said, I have made a career out of precision, reading distance and wind speed and light. I never imagined the same kind of precision applied to this. She was looking at a diagram of root depth relative to moisture level. Roy was doing the same thing I do, reading a system, calculating what is present that you cannot directly see. He would have appreciated hearing that, Clara said, and the past tense landed in the room for a moment, before they both let it settle. Towards the end of the afternoon, Annie put her hands flat on the table and said plainly, I am going to write 3 letters today. One to Senator Aldous Crane in Washington, with Fenn's letter enclosed and a specific request for immediate action on the General Land Office survey. One to a land attorney in Austin named Whitfield Marsh, who I believe is the best in the state at title disputes, and who I believe will take this case if I ask him to. And one to Abel Crockett, if you can give me his last known address, requesting a sworn statement about the 1883 survey. She paused. I will also speak to the editor of the Colton Wells Gazette, if one exists, about the broader situation, not to create pressure on Fitch directly, but to create a record that this community is watching. Clara said, There's a Gazette. The editor's name is Samuel Crook. He is not brave, but he is honest. Honest is sufficient, Annie said. Brave is optional. The letters took 2 hours. Annie wrote them at Clara's kitchen table, in her compact and exact handwriting, and Clara read each one before the envelope was sealed. The letter to Senator Crane was not a request. It was a precise statement of the facts, and a specific statement of what was needed, and by when, signed with the full name that Crane would recognize immediately. The letter to Whitfield Marsh was professional and specific, case particulars, timeline, what she was asking him to do, and the assurance that his fees would be handled. The letter to Abel Crockett was the shortest and perhaps the most important. Simple, direct, respectful, asking him whether he recalled the survey, and whether he would be willing to provide a sworn statement of its accuracy. When the last envelope was sealed, Clara looked at the 3 envelopes on the table and felt something she had almost stopped believing was real. Not that the problem was solved. It was not solved. The hearing was still 6 weeks away, and 6 weeks was not much time, and legal proceedings were not reliable, and Fitch had money and momentum, and the particular advantage of someone who has chosen, strategically, the most difficult possible terrain for his opponent to fight on. But the door was no longer fixed. Annie had stood and put on her hat, and was collecting her coat from the chair when Clara said, I don't know how to thank you for this. Annie turned and looked at her, and there was something in her expression that was not quite a smile. Something quieter and more considered. Don't thank me yet, she said. Let me see if any of it works. Then we'll know what it was worth. She paused with her hand on the doorframe. James, you said he's been going out on jobs with Perryman since he was 15. Good, keep him at it. Whatever happens with the property, keep him learning the method. Roy's knowledge should not be in a box under a floor. It should be in the hands of someone who can use it. She was out the door and down the porch steps before Clara could say anything else, moving with that quick, settled walk. The walk of someone who has always known exactly where their feet are, toward the main street, and whatever she needed to do next. Samuel Crook, the editor of the Colton Wells Gazette, was a small man with tired eyes who had been running a newspaper in a declining county for 11 years, and had developed the philosophical disposition of someone who believes in facts as a kind of spiritual practice, even when facts are inconvenient or unpopular, or bring no reward. He was closing up his print room when Annie knocked, and he opened the door with the expression of a man who had learned not to expect good things from unexpected evening visitors. He recognized her within the first sentence. He did not make a production of it. She told him what she was working on, not the full detail, the shape of it. A family being driven off their land by a title challenge that used a procedural discrepancy as a lever, while the actual value being pursued was a 20-year body of practical knowledge about the aquifer system of this county. She told him what the Briggs Well works had meant to the community. She asked him whether he had covered any of it. He had not. He told her honestly why. Fitch had people in the county who noticed things, and a small newspaper that created problems for Fitch could find its credit lines tightened and its suppliers suddenly unavailable. He was not afraid of Fitch, he said, but he was practical. Annie looked at him for a moment. I understand that, she said. I'm not asking you to attack Fitch. I'm asking you to publish a factual account of the Briggs family's contribution to this county, and a factual description of the title dispute's timeline, and a factual note that Mrs. Briggs has pursued every available legal channel in good faith. You would not need to editorialize. Crook thought about it. Fitch would know I was taking a side. The facts take a side, Annie said. You would just be printing them. He published the account in Thursday's edition. He wrote it carefully, factual, specific, without flourish, exactly the kind of piece that is hardest to attack, because there is nothing inflammatory in it, only information. It ran on the front page because Crook was an honest man, and he knew a front-page story when one arrived on his doorstep. The response in the county was not dramatic. It was the quieter and more durable kind of response. People read it and talked about it, and the talking had a quality of recognition, as if something that had been present, but unverifiable, was now confirmed and thus real. 3 more business owners approached Clara within the week and asked what they could do. One of them, a woman named Pearl Devereaux, who ran the dry goods store, and who had, it turned out, her own complicated history with Colton Land and Title, offered to testify about the economic contribution of the Briggs operation from a different angle entirely. Not as a character witness but as a business neighbor who could document specific transactions and specific value. Senator Crane's response arrived at Annie's hotel room on November 8th. 12 days after she had written the letter, the survey had been located. It was being transmitted by formal document to the district court in San Antonio at the request of the General Land Office, with a cover letter establishing its provenance and filing date. It predated the 1883 survey by 4 years. It was consistent with the 1883 filing in all its material particulars. The discrepancy Fitch's attorneys had identified was, viewed in the context of the 1879 document, an artifact of a notation system change between 2 different survey periods, a clerical evolution, not a substantive irregularity. Annie brought the letter to Clara on a Wednesday morning. She did not knock. The door was already open. Clara was on the porch, watching James and Dutch Perryman loading equipment onto the wagon for a job 2 counties over. Annie handed her the letter. Clara read it standing on the porch, in the October cold, with the wind off the flats moving her hair. She read it twice. James looked over from the wagon and saw his mother's face, and put down what he was holding and came across the yard. What is it? He said. Clara handed him the letter. He read it. Then he looked up at Annie, who was standing at the edge of the porch with her hands in her coat pockets, watching with the expression of someone who has placed a shot and is waiting to see where it lands. Is this enough? James said. It's the central piece, Annie said. Whitfield Marsh will take it from here. He's been in contact with your mother since last week. He believes this closes the primary challenge. She paused. Abel Crockett also responded. He is willing to provide the sworn statement. He is 81 years old and in reasonable health and is, by his account, very interested in having his 1883 survey confirmed by the 1879 record, because he has always believed it was accurate and he is, I quote, considerably annoyed at the suggestion that it wasn't. James made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else. He was 17 and trying to hold his face still, but it was not entirely working. Clara looked at Annie. The morning light was clear and cold, the kind of light that makes everything precise. She said, "Come inside. I'll put the coffee on." "I can't stay," Annie said. "I have a train to catch this afternoon. Frank is waiting for me." She stepped off the porch to go, and then stopped and looked back. "James, you'll keep going out with Dutch." It was not a question, he knew it. "Yes, ma'am. Learn the strata. Learn it specifically, not generally. Your father's notebooks have a section in Volume 4, the blue-covered one, about the limestone shale boundary in this particular county. Start there." James looked at her. "You read it?" "Enough to know it's important," she said. "Don't let it stay in the box." She left the way she had come, without ceremony, without waiting for thanks. walking toward the main street in the clear October cold as if she had somewhere specific to be, which she did. But the direction she moved felt also like the direction of someone who has done what they came to do and is ready to be elsewhere. Dutch Perryman watched her go from the side of the wagon. He had not heard the full conversation. He had heard enough. He did not speak for the rest of the morning. The hearing in San Antonio took place on November 19, 1899. Whitfield Marsh appeared on Clara's behalf. A spare, gray-haired man with an unhurried manner and a legal mind that Fitch's attorneys found, over the course of that day, more formidable than they had anticipated. He presented the 1879 Federal Survey, properly transmitted and authenticated. He presented Abel Crockett's sworn statement, which ran to 4 pages and included a detailed technical explanation of the notation system change between the 1870s and 1880s survey periods that fully accounted for the discrepancy Fitch's attorneys had built their case upon. He presented Pearl Devereaux's testimony about the economic significance of the Briggs operation to the county. Fitch's attorneys argued for 2 hours. The judge, a compact man named Elias Brunt, who had been on the district bench for 19 years and who had a reputation for reading documents very carefully and speaking very concisely, listened to both sides without expression. Then he delivered his ruling. The title challenge was without substantive merit. The 1883 survey was consistent with the federal record, and the original land filing was valid. The property belonged to Clara Briggs, as it had always belonged to Clara Briggs, and the Colton Land and Title Company's claim was dismissed with prejudice. Fitch was not in the courtroom. His attorneys received the ruling in his name. Clara was. She sat in the courtroom gallery and heard the words, and did not move for a long moment. Then she stood and thanked Whitfield Marsh, who told her it had been one of the more clearly argued cases he had worked, once the right documents were in hand. She walked out of the courthouse into the San Antonio afternoon and stood on the steps and thought about Roy, the way she always did when something large happened. What he would have said, what his hands would have done. She thought he would have been pleased in his particular, unpractical way. He would have cared less about the legal victory than about the confirmation that the 1879 survey was accurate, that the 1883 survey was accurate, that everything he had understood about the land and the water in that county had been right. She went home to Colton Wells on the train. There is a question worth sitting with here. Before we follow this story the rest of the way forward, have you ever had someone bring a resource you didn't have? A contact, a piece of knowledge, a door they could open, and do it quietly, without making you feel indebted, without making a performance of the giving. Drop a comment if you have. And if you are finding stories like this one worth your time, the subscribes button is right there. And it means more of this comes your way. Now stay with us for what came next. The 2 employees who had left came back. Not both of them. One moved on permanently to a ranch operation in New Mexico that needed a well crew. But the other, a man named Ted Cahill, who had worked for Roy since 1893, came back in January of 1900 and told Dutch Perryman that he had heard the news, and if there was still a position, he would take it. Dutch had hired him back on the spot, which he had authority to do, because Clara had told him he had authority to do it. By the spring of 1900, the Briggs Well Works was operating at close to the level it had been in Roy's last year. Not because circumstances had dramatically changed. The county was still in decline, and Colton Wells was still a smaller town than it had been. But because the threat had been removed, and the stability that followed was enough. Clara renegotiated 2 contracts that had been in holding patterns during the legal trouble. She brought in a job from a county to the west that needed a full aquifer assessment before they committed to a new settlement site, and Dutch and James and Ted Cahill spent 6 weeks on that assessment, using Roy's methodology as documented in the notebooks. James was 18 by then. He had been reading volume 4 of the notebooks all winter. He had gone out to the land east of town on a Sunday in February, alone, with his father's diagrams in hand, and tried to read what the surface was telling him about what was underneath. He had stood in a field of winter grass and looked at the circular density patterns his mother had described, and looked at the angle of exposed rock strata along the dry creek cut, and had made a calculation. He had dug down 8 feet with a hand auger, which was as deep as he could go alone, and had found the limestone shale boundary exactly where his calculation said it would be. He had gone home and told his mother. Clara had listened and said it was Roy's method working, not magic. James had said he knew that. She had looked at him, this boy, who had his father's careful eyes and his mother's particular stillness, and thought, Roy is in the ground. But what Roy knew is still here. The following year, 1901, Annie Oakley was badly injured in a train accident in North Carolina. The accident was well documented. Her injuries were serious. Her recovery was long, and there was a period when people who knew her work wondered whether she would perform again. She did perform again, eventually, because she was the kind of person who does not let her body be the final argument. But the recovery period changed her relationship to time the way serious injuries often do. It gave her long stretches in which to think about things without the organizing function of performance. She wrote a letter to Clara Briggs that October. Not a long letter. She asked how the case had resolved, though she had already heard through other channels. She asked specifically about James, whether he had continued the work, whether the notebooks were out of the box. Clara wrote back and told her everything. She told her about the Winterfield, about the limestone shale boundary, about the 6 weeks in the western county. She told her that James had, at 18, begun teaching Dutch Perryman the pieces of Roy's method that Dutch had never fully grasped, which was a remarkable reversal of their original relationship, and which Dutch had accepted with the grace of a man who cared more about the work than about the hierarchy. She also told Annie something she had been thinking about since the trial, the thing that had been decisive. The 1879 survey, the letter from Fenn, the specific search parameters, had been sitting in Roy's first notebook for 12 years. She had not known it was useful. She had not known how to use it. What Annie had done, she wrote, was not simply apply resources. She had read the problem the way Roy read the land, looked at the surface signs, and understood what they indicated about what was present below. She had seen the Fenn letter for what it was. Clara had owned it for 12 years and seen only a piece of correspondence. Annie read this letter in her recovery room in North Carolina. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table beside her bed and looked at the ceiling for a while. 15 years passed. The Briggs Well Works became, by 1915, a regional operation. James Briggs was 33 and ran it with Dutch Perryman as his senior foreman, and they had 8 employees. He had expanded the methodology documentation, taken his father's 23 notebooks and synthesized them into a training manual that he called, simply, Reading the Land, which he used to train new crew members. Rose had become a school teacher, which would have surprised no one who had watched her move through school with that particular forward-leaning attention. She taught in Colton Wells for 4 years and then moved to a larger district in Abilene, where she eventually became the head of a school for girls. Clara was 60 in 1916. She was still doing the books for the Briggs Well Works and still negotiating contracts, though James had taken over the primary operations entirely. She was also doing something she had not expected to find herself doing. She was teaching, not formally, but in the specific way that knowledge that has been carried alone for a long time eventually overflows. People came to ask her about land assessments, about water rights, about the practical mechanics of what the Briggs operation had documented. She answered every question completely, the way Roy had answered questions, without holding anything back, because information is the only thing you can give completely and still keep. Annie Oakley died in November of 1926 in Greenville, Ohio. She was 66 years old and had gone home to the state she came from, which seemed right to everyone who had followed her long enough to understand that she had always been, underneath the performances and the applause, a woman from a particular stretch of land who had never entirely left it. Frank Butler died 18 days later. James Briggs read about her death in the Abilene paper that November. He was 44 years old and sitting at a kitchen table that was different from the one in the Colton Wells house, but was organized the same way, with the folders on the shelf and the lamp positioned for nighttime reading. He sat with the paper for a while. Then he went to the locked box. There was still a locked box. There would always be a locked box. And took out his father's first notebook and also, carefully unfolded from the inside back cover, a letter from a woman in traveling clothes who had arrived at his mother's door on a Tuesday morning in October 1899, and asked if there was time to talk. The letter was Annie's original note to Senator Crane, which Clara had kept. It was 4 paragraphs. The handwriting was the compact and exact script of a person accustomed to placing words where they were needed with no excess. At the bottom below the signature, She had written a line that was not part of the official letter, but was addressed to Clara directly. Whatever they decide, keep the notebooks working. That is the part of this that does not depend on any court. James held the letter for a long time. Then he put it back in the box. In 1937, Rose Briggs, then 52, and running a school in Abilene, was approached by an archivist from a Texas Historical Society who was collecting materials related to the water development of the Southern Plains. She provided Roy's 23 original notebooks, James's training manual, Reading the Land, and a file of documents related to the 1899 title case. She also provided, framed behind glass, a copy of Annie Oakley's letter to Senator Crane, with the handwritten note at the bottom. The archivist looked at it for a long time before he put it in the collection. The exhibit that housed these materials was titled Water and Knowledge: The Documentation of Aquifer Resources in the Southern Plains, 1880 to 1920. It ran for 6 months and was attended by students, engineers, land surveyors, and a handful of elderly men who had worked in well operations earlier in their lives, and who stood in front of Roy's notebooks with the particular expression of people who recognize a piece of the world they once moved through. The placard beside Annie's letter read, "Donated by the Briggs family, Abilene, Texas." This letter, written in October 1899, set in motion the legal actions that preserved the Briggs Well Works and its 20-year documentation of Southern Plains aquifer systems. The technical knowledge preserved by this action trained 3 subsequent generations of water engineers in this region. The letter was written by a woman who had no personal stake in the outcome, no legal obligation, and no professional reason to stop. She stopped because she was paying attention. James Briggs died in 1952. Dutch Perryman had died in 1934. Had died in 1941 at 85, in the Colton Wells house she had never left, with the locked box still under the floorboard. Because some things you keep close even when the danger is long past. A historian named Evelyn Marsh, no relation to Whitfield, wrote a detailed account of the Briggs case in 1965 as part of a broader study of title fraud in the post-Reconstruction Southwest. She spent considerable time on the 1899 encounter and what it had produced. She interviewed Rose, who was 80 by then and still teaching, whose memory was precise in the way of people who have organized their lives around accuracy. Rose described Annie sitting at the kitchen table, reading Roy's notebooks with that quality of genuine attention, asking the specific questions. She described Annie correcting her own wrong answer about the buffalo grass without any sign of embarrassment. Marsh asked Rose what had stayed with her most about that day. Rose thought about it. Then she said, "She didn't come in and tell us what she could do. She came in and asked to hear everything. And she actually listened. Not to be polite, not to gather information she could use later. She listened because the thing my mother was carrying was worth listening to. You could tell the difference." She paused. "My mother had been carrying it alone for 2 years. You could see something change in her when she understood that someone else was actually in the room with her. That is the thing that does not have a name in any accounting ledger, in any legal filing, in any historical record of land rights and title challenges in the Southern Plains. It is not in the exhibit, and not in the court documents, and not in the placard. It is in Rose's testimony, in one sentence, and in the memory of a kitchen table where 2 women sat with some notebooks and some coffee on a Tuesday morning in October, and where one of them finally said everything, and the other one heard it. Not every act of courage announces itself. Not every intervention looks like an intervention. Sometimes it looks like a woman arriving at a door, in traveling clothes, and asking if there's time to talk, and then actually staying for the answer, and then doing the next thing and the next, without drama, without reward, without asking to be remembered for it. The ones who are built that way do not choose it for an audience. They do it in the spaces where nobody is watching, and the only thing that keeps them there is the understanding that something real is at stake. And they happen to be the person who showed up. Annie Oakley rode into Colton Wells alone. Nobody asked her to stay. She stayed anyway. She did what she could. She left before the thanks could find her, and she moved on to wherever she was going next. That is what she told her. She meant every word. It was enough. If this story found you somewhere you needed it today, if you know what it is to be finally heard, or to be the one who finally listened, leave a comment below and let us know where you are watching from. Stories like this one only travel as far as the people who share them. If you want more of them, subscribe, and we will keep bringing them to you.